On Wednesday, October 11th, 1865, in the town of Morant Bay, located in the parish of St. Thomas, which was then known as St. Thomas in the East, a protest march led by the local preacher, Paul Bogle, witnessed the tragic loss of 7 lives among the protesters. The volunteer militia, tasked with safeguarding the courthouse and the magistrates, responded with lethal force, leading to further violence as protesters retaliated by setting fire to the courthouse and adjacent buildings. The aftermath of that day saw the death toll rise to 25 civilians, marking the beginning of what history has termed the Morant Bay Rebellion. However, upon closer examination, it becomes evident that this was not a rebellion, but rather a ruthless massacre of over 400 citizens, accompanied by the unjust arrests and swift executions of more than 300 individuals, many of whom were innocent. So, here is the evidence. Now, the events leading up to the tragedy reveal a series of misjudgments and provocations on the part of the authorities, because on Saturday, the 7th of October 1865, 2 justices of the peace, Mr. Walton, the owner of a plantation close by, and another gentleman who was unnamed at the time, and both of whom were among those who were slain the following week, were sitting in the Morant Bay courthouse. They were reviewing cases and making judgments, as the European planters were not trusted to do so, because these cases mostly involved land disputes and other matters, in which these planter magistrates would help and favor each other, as most of them also had cases in the courts, especially for not paying their laborers. But for some reason, this decision of the 2 JPs failed to satisfy the residents, who wanted to have their say in court. So many of them started to enter the courthouse to express their discontent with the procedure. This caused the magistrates to feel threatened, so they ordered the police to lock up those who were complaining. Upon hearing this, the residents quickly retreated from the courthouse, but when they reached outside, the police attempted to arrest one of the residents, whom they claim was boisterous and disrespectful. That act was both illegal and unwise, because at the time, the police had no authority to arrest a person without a warrant, and the act committed was seized when the people left the courthouse. So the man's friends became upset, and rightfully so. They started to protest, which did not do anything else than to ignite the flames, as the people were already angry. But you see, all the atrocities that occurred between October 11th and 24 could have been prevented at this point, only if the magistrates had used their discretion, due to seeing the rising tension at the time. However, as fate would have it, when court resumed the following Monday, the 9th of October, the magistrates charged a man with trespassing and sentenced him to a fine or life imprisonment. Sitting in the courthouse at the time was the local preacher, Paul Bogle, who started to give the man advice about appealing the magistrate's decision. And being that at the time Bogle was a man of superior intelligence and had considerable influence amongst the laborers in his community, the residents often looked to him for advice. Irritated by Bogle's interference, the magistrates maliciously brought up an old case and began to issue warrants against Paul Bogle and several bystanders, charging them with obstructing the law and stopping police from doing their duty. To the residents, however, this felt like a declaration of war against them, because they had done nothing more than to resist the illegal arrest of one of their fellow citizens without a warrant, and the act itself could not have any other effect, considering no one got hurt. Now it seems they will have to fight violence with violence. The following day, a brave posse of officers, 4 to be exact, were sent to arrest those whose names were on the warrants. These names, however, amounted to 28. Bogle and his associates resisted the officers and held them hostage for a short while, releasing them unarmed. The magistrates, however, kept making the same mistakes over and over again, and with their selfish and corrupt proceedings, they raised a monster that they could neither subdue nor control. Wednesday, the 11th of October, was the day that the quarterly meeting of the parish vestry was held. Everyone who thought they were someone was in attendance, including the parish authorities and the custos, who was the head. They were quite alarmed to hear about the protests that happened in the past few days. And right here, would I think say them would have sufficient discretion to reason with the people and find an amicable solution. But no, they could think of no other solution but to resort to brute force. So they started to write an exaggerated account of the events that occurred to send to the governor, so that they could request military aid. In the meantime, a small army of volunteer militia was sent to Morant Bay to protect the vestry, because it was rumored that Paul Bogle and a large number of protesters had intended to go to Morant Bay that day. They could never have made a more devastating mistake, sending a volunteer army, as these people were not trained, but had weapons. And this was another step leading to the atrocities that ensued. If there was even one person among the officers with a cool head who could negotiate or advise the residents to remain calm, there would have been no riot, and the fateful events of that day and what led up to the 24th could have been avoided. It was also unfortunate that George William Gordon was not present on this fateful day, as he was even scheduled to be a part of the vestry meeting. If Gordon was present, a few words from a man they knew and respected would have been sufficient. Unfortunately, Gordon could not be there as he was ill, and that one clergyman, magistrate or vestryman had the courage or ability to do what the situation demanded. But despite all of this, the vestry meeting went on as usual and came to a close without any interruptions. The members of the vestry were about to have dinner, as they normally do after vestry meetings, at the expense of the parish. However, before the first course could be served, a large group of people began to assemble in the square adjacent to the courthouse. Now, no one in the courthouse had any knowledge as to the reason for this gathering. However, they came to the conclusion that it was nothing more than a much similar march to the reform marches that were happening in London at the time. And these marches overall were not violent, but seen as people protesting for their rights and freedom. In the Royal Commission of Inquiry investigations that followed the massacre, up until this point, failed to bring to light any evidence that the residents were plotting a rebellion. And at the same time, this is where we start to see evidence why this should be indeed classified as a massacre instead of a rebellion. Before we go further, these are the definition of both words. A massacre. A massacre typically refers to the indiscriminate killing of a large number of people, often carried out by a group or government against unarmed civilians or a specific group. It's generally seen as a one-sided violent act with a significant power imbalance. On the other hand, a rebellion involves a group of people rising up against authority, often due to grievances or a desire for change. Unlike a massacre, however, rebellion involves active resistance and an attempt to challenge or overthrow the established authority. And now we'll look at some of the reasons why we can clearly see that this was a massacre. Here are some of the reasons why we can clearly see that there was not a plot among the residents to challenge or overthrow those in authority. The residents brought no firearms with them. Those that they used were taken from the police station when they realized more volunteer militia was on their way. And also, the fact that those who were killed on the steps of the courthouse were beaten to death and not shot nor chopped would show that they were not armed even with a cutlass. So it's starting to come to light that the assembling of the residents on the 11th of October was not premeditated. It was an ill-judged act that was escalated due to the injudicious decisions of those in authority. Now, the brutal and indiscriminate killing of all who were involved in the riot or connected to those involved, who could have shed some light on the subject, had made it more impossible to obtain any satisfactory information about the views and the plans of the rioters. But the fact that no trace of a plot could be discovered, that they had traveled to Morant Bay unarmed, they did not injure or attempt to injure anyone until they were fired on, plus a considerable number of them were killed or wounded, renders it really absurd to look at these actions as an attempted rebellion or coup or anything more than a riot which could have been prevented by the men in the courthouse by using a little discretion. Unfortunately, these men in the courthouse, they paid with their lives for the errors that they hurried to make. And to prove further that this was indeed a massacre, a petition letter was sent to the governor just a day before the riot started. This letter was signed by James Dacres, Paul Bogle, James McLaren, and others, all of whom were quickly hung afterwards by military tribunal. In this extraordinary petition letter, they complained about the conduct of the magistrates, represented themselves as loyal to the Queen, and also they expressed their belief that the attack by the police in Morant Bay was a violation of their rights because they had the right to resist the illegal arrests of residents. They further complained that they were oppressed by the magistrates for over 27 years, and they called upon the governor to protect them. Otherwise, they will have to take the law into their own hands. So now, here's a copy of the petition letter from these oppressed residents.
That night, Paul Bogle also sits down to write. Tomorrow he is to start his march on Morant Bay as he promised, but this letter is a last gesture on the side of law and peace, a last forlorn cry for help.
Now, does this sound like a people who were engaged in or about to carry out a deadly overthrow of the authorities and to kill white Europeans? No, I think these are people who were honestly using the right channels to appeal to the authorities to find an amicable solution. This in itself is sufficient proof that the protest which took place the day after the letter was sent to the governor was not premeditated, but was provoked by the chain of events which took place immediately after the letter was forwarded to the governor. Now, the petition letter was sent by special messenger. Wanna listen? As was all other important papers at the time. And it is also in evidence that Governor Eyre was handed this letter the afternoon of the 11th, just a short while after receiving the communication from the Custos requesting military aid. So now, if the governor was prudent and carried out his duties as his position required, he would have done what his predecessor in office, Earl Mulgrave, had done in a similar situation, repairing the spot where mischief was most threatening. But to prove further that he was not fit for the position he occupied, he simply gave orders to send the soldiers to Morant Bay, disregarded the petition of the oppressed residents, and went away to a dinner party in the mountains. Riots started breaking out the same evening, and when the governor realized his mistake, he hid the petition letter further and did not even mention it in his dispatches to the colonial office. It may not have been brought forward if he was not compelled by the proceedings of the Royal Commission. But what is strange though is that the messenger that delivered the letter to the governor was severely punished by flogging by a magistrate known to us only as Ramsey. It is not clear if the governor gave the order, but it would be difficult to imagine how Ramsey would have knowledge of the situation. And as far as the evidence goes, everyone who signed or had anything to do with the petition was hunted down and killed by the militia. The events that occurred on that fateful day in October could have been prevented, as the actions of the complaining residents and the way they marched into Morant Bay on the day of the vestry meeting was unwise, and that is not to be denied. But even so, the Custos and those with him in the courthouse at the time were much more culpable, Out of anger, they did not realize the best thing to do was to go out and listen to what the people had to say. Because at the end of the day, that's all the people wanted. However, as fate would have it, the volunteer militia of 28 men were ordered to fire upon the residents. This was all it needed to bring on a fearful crisis, which turned into a massacre of hundreds of innocent people. So people, let me know what you think, because a rebellion this started out as a rebellion, but obviously it turned into a massacre. These people were protesting. We can say the most, it was a riot. But when the militia was ordered to fire upon these people, that's when it turned the other way. And this is actually a massacre because these people weren't trying to overthrow the government or anything like that. They weren't even armed when they went to Morant Bay. But guys, this is just day 7 to 11. The next video will cover day 11 to 15. And then the other video will be 15 to 24. That's the day of the execution of Paul Bogle. So let me know what you think, guys. If you're interested in this series, I've been privy to a lot of information which I did not have. And I'll be debunking a lot of the historical myths. So if you're interested in that, please let me know. Alright? Y'all stay blessed. Have a wonderful day.